We're just waiting for Michael to join. He said he's running 2-3 minutes late. So as soon as he comes, then we will start. Hello, Michael. Nice to see you here. I hope your Pakistan trip is going well. You are on mute. Let's see if I can unmute you. Um,
There we go.
yeah. Are you in Lahore?
No, I'm not. I'm not in Pakistan yet. Not for another few days. But
Ah,
I'll
sorry. I
I'll be in
thought that
Lahore shortly.
my fault. I thought that you'll be there this week.
Next week.
This week.
Next
Okay.
week, which will be a very interesting week to be there. But anyway, no, still in the U.S. So
Oh, so it
it's
must
a
be very early
top of the
morning.
morning here.
Yes.
Yeah,
So
no, it's actually this is a let me put it this way. This is a nice way to start the day.
not such a nice topic or becoming a dangerous topic, but we can kick off. Firstly, thank you for taking your time for this. You've always been generous, and many people in Pakistan follow you. In fact, I was just speaking to somebody before this call, and he was a person in the government, and he said that he follows you very closely, and he thinks you are the best expert on the geopolitical events, and your overall read of Pakistan is very accurate. So,
Oh,
so
it's very kind.
fortunate to have you with us. Um, just today, there were Israeli attacks on Iran in the retaliation of the attacks by Iran. Where are we headed? Perhaps we can start with that. What do you think? Do you think this issue will escalate? Will it end? Will it lead to World War III? Where are we headed?
Well, I mean, the good news is I don't think we're headed to World War III, and I certainly hope that we're not wrong. My sense is that the Biden administration has been applying quite extensive pressure on Israel not to retaliate too aggressively, and of course, we'll see what happens in the next few days. But indeed, what appears to have happened this morning was a limited strike or limited strikes, as I understand it. Again, who knows what's going to come next? But my understanding is the Biden administration does not want to see a wider war. It doesn't want to see a deeper crisis, and of course, despite everything that's happened in recent months, the U.S.-Israel relationship remains a very significant one, and I think Israel continues to see the U.S. as its by far its most critical partner. And despite the Netanyahu's very aggressive tactics, I think that it will be responsive to significant levels of U.S. pressure. Now, as you know, next week is also the Passover holiday, so I don't know if that would impact the plans of the Israeli government, if it would want to not be engaging in these types of activities at that point. I don't know. But at this point, my sense, I'm cautiously optimistic that this will not escalate any further. And in an ideal world, we won't see any more actions from Israel against Iran at all. But at the end of the day, we're in this business knowing that sometimes we have to speculate and sometimes we know that we might be wrong. And I hope that I'm not. But indeed, the situation remains quite tense. And I think so long as the war in Gaza continues and Israel has given no indication that it is planning to de-escalate in any way, the plan is still to destroy Hamas, which I don't know how you can do that under the current circumstances. So long as Israel's war in Gaza continues, I think that we can expect that the broader levels of instability that we've seen in the Middle East will continue, and Iran will continue to engage in its own incredibly destabilizing activities through its work with its proxies, Hamas and Hezbollah. And so I think that we're not out of the woods at all in this crisis, and just have to see how things play out in the coming weeks and months.
Do you have any sense of what did the Israelis attack in Isfahan? And then was this a nuclear facility? And then what I'm trying to understand is whether this was a high value attack or whether was it just a symbolic attack? So what are the chances of a retaliation strike by Iran based on what has just happened?
Yeah, I mean, my sense I mean, keeping in mind that I'm not an expert on Iran's policies, the messaging from Iran all along has suggested that it does not want an escalation. Um, in terms of its current crisis with Israel. I mean, we saw the messaging coming from the Iranian government after its drone strikes in Israel, where it essentially said, "We believe that this crisis is now over." Um, and I don't know. It's still. I mean, it's fairly early in the morning here, and this latest phase in the crisis happened overnight. So I'm still trying to get a better sense as to what happened. The reportage hasn't been very clear in terms of what exactly was struck. There's been some indications that military targets were struck, which I think that certainly is less escalatory than if you had civilians that have been hit. We still don't know, I think, some of the details of that. But if it turns out that these were military facilities that were hit, if they're not nuclear facilities, which I imagine they were not, and there's no more activities forthcoming from Israel, then I would think that there's a good chance that Iran would not retaliate with more direct strikes. But again, still waiting to get a bit more clear information as to what types of targets were struck. But your point about nuclear facilities is an important one, because my understanding is that initially Israel had put on the table a series of possible responses, and one of the types of responses did indeed include Iranian military facilities. Again, we have to see what comes in the coming days. I don't have any indication that what was hit last night or this morning were nuclear facilities. That remains to be seen.
And what's the assessment or the word on this assessment of in the US of the Iranian strike? Because we hear different views. Like there's one view in the media which was that this was more hot air, just a show of strength and not a strike which was meant to hurt anybody. But on the other hand, there's also commentary that no, this was intended. There were 200 or 300 drone and missile attack, and they were meant to harm people. And if it was not for the defenses, then people would have it would have led to serious casualties. What's your assessment? And then what's the assessment? I know you are not the Iranian expert, but what's the assessment in the US in the think tank circle? Was it for real, or was it uh, just for a display?
I think that one has to distinguish between the responses or the perceptions of the U.S. government and official Washington versus, the experts outside of the government. I think that the Biden administration itself viewed those attacks as very provocative and meant to be escalatory, keeping in mind that there's long been very strong hostile perceptions of Iran from U.S. governments, whether Republican or Democrat. I've always argued that you see levels of demonization of Iran in official Washington on levels that you really don't see with many other countries at all, other than perhaps North Korea. And of course, this goes back to the history of 79 and so on. And as you know, the Biden administration had come to office wanting to explore better relations with Iran, particularly after what happened in the Trump administration, what happened with the nuclear deal with Iran, and so on. But things change in a hurry, especially after October 7th. So I think that the Biden administration will always attribute the worst possible or the most nefarious, malign motives to anything that Iran does, particularly when it targets Israel, such a close friend of the U.S. But I think that in terms of the expert perceptions from outside of the U.S. government have indeed been quite different, and I think the consensus is that these actions by Iran were really meant to save face and not much else, in the sense that they were meant to show the Iranian public above all else, but also other audiences, that Iran could not let what happened previously go without a response. And this, of course, refers to the Israeli attacks that killed a number of Iranian military personnel at the embassy in Syria. Even though we're talking about large numbers of drones and missiles, what was it, several hundred, whatever it was, the administration's argument, that means that this was very escalatory and provocative. But the view of the experts is that, well, these were not all that destructive. Most of them were shot down. They weren't in a position to do much damage. It was, since they were traveling so slowly, these drones, it was easy to track them and it was easy to prepare to shoot them down. So it was almost like they were intended not to cause that much damage in Israel, which, I think for the expert community on Iran here in Washington suggests that these military activities by Iran were not meant to be provocative or escalatory. And indeed, going back to what I said earlier, the Iranian government messaging that came after this operation was that, we're done. The crisis is done. We've done what we need to do. Let's now move on.
How effective is the power of diplomacy, or are there any backdoor negotiations going on between Iran, Israel, and on the crux of the issue, which is Israel, Gaza, because now it has been almost a year, and we have been hearing for a while that a peace deal is around the corner, but it hasn't. We haven't seen any peace. So, does that mean that diplomacy is not that effective, and does it mean that the U.S. also does not have substantial leverage on Israel? And then, where are we? Is there any hope for peace?
You mean peace in terms of between Iran and Israel? Is that what you were referring
And
to?
then firstly, Israel-Gaza situation, and
Uh,
then also Israel-Iran. Like, is there anybody in between? Like, whenever there's tensions between, let's say, India and Pakistan, we expect the US to be playing a role of broker in terms of mediating. Is there any
mhm.
some? Is there a trusted party here who is playing that role? Um,
Yeah, I think that, I mean, there has been significant attempts at diplomacy from so many different actors, including the United States, vis-a-vis the Israel-Hamas war. But I think that the U.S. would not be viewed as an honest broker, or, well, the U.S. would not be viewed as a neutral mediator, so to speak, given that it has this very strong relationship with Israel. And I think that what also is significant is that in the immediate weeks, if not months, after the October 7th attacks, the U.S. was so explicitly behind Israel in terms of backing its response and not really doing much to try to prevent Israel from, the escalation of its attacks and its war in Hamas. I think that emboldened Israel, quite frankly. Only more recently, as the scale and the scope of the horrific humanitarian cost in Gaza has become more clear, and also as the political pressure has risen on Biden, as we've seen the very large angry response from the Arab American and the Muslim American community in an election year, only then have we seen the Biden administration take on a different tack, where it's trying to apply more pressure on Israel to, first of all, do ensure that humanitarian aid can come in and so on, but also beyond that, think about de-escalating the conflict. Only more recently have we seen that change. And so I think that's made it more difficult to expect there to be successful mediation efforts on the part of the United States. You could certainly look to some of the regional actors, those that have formal relations with Israel, right? And that includes some of the Abraham Accord states like the UAE. It could also include countries like Jordan and Egypt. And I think those might be more effective mediators for peace. But they have their own pressures, right? They may have formal relations with Israel, but for political reasons, it's important that they do everything they can to express their support for the Palestinians and so on. At any rate, it's a very difficult, delicate diplomatic um, feat, so to speak. This is very difficult. And also, I mean, the bottom line, I think it's sort of similar to the dynamic with the Russian invasion of Ukraine. The Israelis just seem dead set on doing whatever they have to do, and they're not necessarily going to be deterred or dissuaded by anyone, including their closest friends and their closest allies. And I do think that the U.S.-Israel relationship has taken some hits, given that in more recent weeks, the Biden administration has really applied pressure on the Israelis to scale down, even if a bit, and the Israelis have not been very receptive to that at all. It's also notable, as you know, that there's been significant levels of anger within Israel itself to the Israeli government's actions. And the Netanyahu government, which was quite unpopular even before this whole war started, is really under the gun. But again, I don't necessarily think it's going to be receptive to that political pressure, even though at some points we've seen mass protests in Israel against Israel's actions in Gaza. But again, it seems that the Israeli goal at this point is to continue this war until it destroys Hamas. But again, that's very difficult to do, especially when many of the senior Hamas leaders are not even located in Israel. They're in Doha and other places. I don't think that we can expect any possibility of any type of peace deal or even rapprochement between Israel and Iran. I mean, that really is one of the most hostile relationships in the world today. There's very little that can be done there. And you certainly could think of a few neutral actors that might be effective, hypothetically, as a mediator. And, some very interesting countries come to mind. One of them is China, which is very quietly has a pretty good relationship with Israel, particularly on the commercial side. And some years ago, it signed this big, I think, 20-year strategic partnership with Iran. So China could be looked at as a potential mediator, but I think it's just too much. I don't think China would want to insert itself in a mediation effort that would seem to be so ambitious and so unlikely to succeed. And given what's happened since October 7th, it's made it even more difficult to expect that there could be any type of reconciliation between Iran and Israel. And I think there's always track two dialogues going on in any context, which is great. Sometimes they work, sometimes they don't. And I think that in this case, even if you get a bunch of Iranians and Israelis in the same room in some neutral site, I don't think that would be enough, just because there's just too much hostility at play between the two countries. And the final point on this, the geopolitical and diplomatic developments that have played out in the Middle East over the last 2 years, including the Abraham Accords, I think those are developments that have driven the two countries even further apart. I mean, many have argued that one reason why Iran has been intensifying its support for its proxies to go after Israel, including with the Hamas attack on October 7th, is its unhappiness about the Abraham Accords, the view that efforts are being made to isolate it from the rest of the Middle East by trying to pressure countries around the region to formalize relations with Israel, which Iran has no interest whatsoever in doing.
No, absolutely. I think that was a publicly stated goal of Hamas's attack, which initiated the whole thing in the first place. But if I look at the region now more broadly, we have seen Russia invade Ukraine. Before that, or after that, we saw that India was buying oil from Russia, despite US telling the world that putting Russia on sanctions. And now we are seeing Israel choosing a policy, and despite some pushback from the US, showing insensitivity to US pressure. Does that mean that we read about the rise of the middle powers in these countries, which are becoming more independent about the foreign policies and decision making? Does that mean that the US, is it indicative that the US influence on regional powers, whether it's Russia or whether it's India or whether that's Israel, is becoming less effective? And does that mean that the world will now look for alternative brokers for peace, whether it's China or whether it's Saudi Arabia or whether it's a consortium of other countries? Because somebody needs to be there to play that role of mediating conflicts, right?
Yeah, that's a great point, and I think the answer is yes. In addition to the examples that you cited about the limits of U.S. leverage vis-a-vis mediation and peacemaking, and not only that, but also U.S. leverage on the whole, I would look to the issue of China, right? I mean, the U.S. for quite some time has been trying to build a broader coalition of countries to counter Chinese power. And it has been effective to an extent, particularly in terms of building a coalition among a number of countries in the West and beyond. But at the end of the day, it's struggled, particularly because so many countries, including many in Europe and the US itself, for that matter, remain reliant on Chinese economic support and trade and so on. And if you look at the global South in particular, that's an area where the U.S. has made very little headway, not just in terms of gathering a larger coalition to counter China, but also to oppose the Russian invasion of Ukraine, right? We've seen the voting record of the global South and the UN and the China front. So many countries in the global South are not at all willing to decouple themselves from China. They really see Chinese assistance, whether infrastructure assistance or other forms of financial aid, as essential for their interest. And then you have some countries that are close partners of the U.S. that are willing to remain close to the U.S. for, in terms of security partnership, but want to really have it both ways and look to China for economic assistance as well. I mean, you have a lot of countries around the global South that like to do what India has done for many years and manage their relations with rival states, perform a type of strategic autonomy. But this is worked against U.S. interests. So yeah, I think that there have been limits to what the U.S. is able to do. I don't want to underplay the successes that remain. Going back to the Abraham Accords, I think that was one of the biggest diplomatic feats and efforts toward peace in the Middle East in many years. And ironically, it came at the initiative of an administration that has been so heavily criticized for its foreign policy failures, the Trump administration. It's remarkable, right, that you've had a number of countries in the Middle East that were so hostile to Israel for so long, and now they have formal relations with it. And even now, it's remarkable that experts on the Middle East seriously believe that Saudi Arabia has still not ruled out the possibility of one day pursuing its own efforts toward peace with Israel, which is quite remarkable, particularly given what's happened over the last few months. But yeah, to the second part of your question, indeed, I do think that we have to look at other brokers, other actors that can play the role of peace mediators around the world. And we've already seen a number of them emerge, right? China certainly has become very present. And, here we could cite the very striking rapprochement deal between Saudi Arabia and Iran. That was brokered by Beijing. And we could also look at countries like Qatar that have become increasingly active in mediation, including in South Asia. My understanding is that Qatar has been active in mediating tensions between India and Pakistan in recent years, and also might well have played a role in the border or the LOC truce between Iran and Pakistan, India and Pakistan some time ago. So yeah, there are other countries that have emerged. India, of course, has made itself has projected itself as a country that can serve as a bridge between the developed and developing worlds. I think that's still a goal that's playing out. I don't think it's achieved that goal yet. But many have cited India as one of the few countries that might be in a position to mediate a de-escalation of the war in Ukraine because of its special relationship with Russia and its close relationship with Ukraine as well. So this all benefits the global South, right? Which is all about promoting multipolarity and trying to dull the strength of a unipolar world. I don't think it is a unipolar world, not by a long shot. So, and I think that's a good thing. I think we need to see a proliferation of actors beyond the US that have the capacity to try to de-escalate these terrible conflicts playing out seemingly all over the place these days.
Do you think that this whatever we see in terms of the rise of the global South and this move diminishing or slightly diminishing of the US influence in the region, is that a function of long-term structural trend in the US economy, which people like Ray Dalio talk about, or is it just because of Biden administration, which means that if President Trump returns, then we should see and then supporters of President Trump would argue, then none of this would have happened if he was a president. So do you think it's an administration issue, or do you think it's some long-term structural trend regarding the influence of US?
I think it's more of the latter thing that you noted, sort of long-term structural changes. I mean, we've seen for quite some years the emergence of new organizations, new forums, new economic institutions that are meant to serve as a counter to the US and the West. I mean, BRICS, of course, is one of the oldest ones. That's been around for a long time. It is notable that BRICS is expanding, right? And same with one of the other longstanding organizations seen as a counter to the West, that being the SCO, the Shanghai Cooperation Organization. It has also been expanding. And I think, honestly, that speaks to the increasing strength of China, right? China has been leading a lot of this, in some cases with the assistance of Russia. And both BRICS and SCO are led by China and Russia. But you could also look at some newer entities like the AIIB, the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank. It's been around a while, not as long as BRICS. So, and China is a dominant actor there as well. So I think that we just have to look at how the world order is changing, that it is not a unipolar world, and China's rise, and it has risen. I don't think it's accurate to talk about how China's rising. It rose a long time ago. That, I think, has created these opportunities for more multipolarity, because China, shares the Indian view, quite frankly, of trying to promote more multipolarity around the world, and that entails empowering the global South. China and India, of course, want to have a leadership role in these efforts. But this is all meant to push back against the U.S. and what the U.S. is up to. But I wouldn't overstate this. I think that we talk a lot about how it's very difficult to expect the world to, or the West, or certainly the global South, to decouple economically from China. I think the same is the case with the U.S., right? I mean, you can't just decouple from the dollar, so to speak. I think that the dominant U.S. role in the global economy is not going to change anytime soon. I think that there could be more progress in other spaces, in strategic spaces, as we see China and other powers, not major powers by China, but middle powers, the Saudis for sure, as well as the BRICS countries and India and South Indonesia, countries like that, as they begin to build out more clout and strength and do more. I think that will continue to pose a challenge to U.S. power, U.S. influence. And I do think that U.S. policy actions in the Middle East have been a big boost for the global South. I mean, certainly we know that how the U.S. has responded to the Israeli war in Gaza has been a huge driver, it's galvanized the global South for sure. We saw that to an extent with how the U.S. was handling the Russian war in Ukraine. I mean, the global South understandably doesn't like pressure, right? Most countries don't like to be pressured by the biggest, most powerful countries in the world. They didn't want to feel pressured to take the U.S. side in the war in Ukraine. And then as great power competition has continued to intensify, this means that many countries in the global South are feeling pressure from the U.S. to take their side vis-a-vis China. They don't want to do that. So I think that has provided additional incentives to develop alternative models that can push back against the U.S. And China certainly wants to exploit that. India has been able to exploit that. But of course, India is in a very different role because it balances its relations with both West and non-West, developed world, global South, and so on. So short answer to your question is that, yeah, we are seeing a sea change in the world order in terms of more space out there for countries wanting to provide and develop alternatives to the U.S. and Western models, but don't think it's a new thing necessarily, not necessarily tied specifically to Biden administration policies, but certainly what the U.S. has done since October 7th has, I think, added to this dynamic.
No, thank you. So now with that, let's move to Pakistan, because what does all of this mean for Pakistan? And there have been multiple things which we have spoken about so far. So why don't we first start with Iran conflict? What does that mean for Pakistan?
Well, I mean, as you all know, I mean, lots of things have changed. The Iranian president is due in Pakistan on Monday, right? So that sort of is a very interesting frame through which we can look at this question. As I understand it, the trip had been scheduled for quite some time, but I think the tenor of the conversations may change a bit given what's happened in recent days. Um, I guess three immediate responses on this. One, there is what I would describe as a not now effect at play. Pakistan, of course, has so much that it's dealing with internally with its economy, with political volatility, with the rise in terrorism, and also with worsening tensions on its borders with Afghanistan, for sure, as well as Iran. We'd seen that brief military crisis between Iran and Pakistan earlier this year. The last thing Pakistan wants to see is a war in the Middle East or even wider instability. Certainly not a war involving Iran because it shares a long border with Pakistan. And the Shia, you have a very sizable Shia community in Pakistan, which I think also adds to this dynamic of Pakistan not wanting to see anything happen in the region that could be stabilizing for Pakistan itself. Secondly, I think that there could be a major, assuming that this crisis continues to play out for a while, there could be a significant diplomatic cost for Pakistan. And what I mean by that is that when the Saudis and the Iranians concluded their rapprochement deal some time ago, that opened up a lot of diplomatic space for Pakistan. In that I think that the view in Islamabad is that it had more space to engage with Iran without having to worry about how Saudi Arabia would react. The understanding being if Saudi Arabia had a better relationship with Iran, it would be less nervous or anxious if Pakistan is engaging more closely with Iran. But now, with this new crisis, the U.S. relationship with Iran, which had already been so fraught in recent years, has really fallen to rock bottom. And so I think that for Islamabad, which is very keen to ensure that its relations with the U.S. remain stable, particularly for economic reasons, given, we all know about the U.S.-Pakistan trade relationship and how important the U.S. is in that regard, top destination for Pakistani exports, U.S. influence at the IMF, and so on and so forth. Pakistan doesn't want to do anything that could risk aggravating its relations with the U.S. And so I think that it will now feel that it has to be very careful about how it engages with Iran, which it wants to do, despite the tensions coming out of that military crisis. Trade is a very important thing in this relationship. Pakistan wants to explore that, but now the diplomatic space that it believed it had won, that it had gained from the Saudi-Iranian deal, I think it feels is at risk of shrinking once again because of this new development. And third, on a very tactical level, and this may follow from the second point, we've all heard that Pakistan is finally committed to building its part of the pipeline with Iran. Who knows if that'll actually happen, but Pakistan seems intent on doing so now. But it would not want to risk sanctions with the U.S., and the U.S. has given no indication whatsoever that it would be willing to support at all an Iran-Pakistan pipeline. But with this crisis now breaking out between Iran and Israel and how the U.S. has reacted to it, I think that there's really no chance at all that the U.S. will be comfortable with this pipeline, this hypothetical pipeline, would not be willing to provide a sanction waiver to Iran. Even before this crisis broke out, I don't think it would have been willing to provide a sanction waiver to Pakistan. And so this then puts Pakistan in a very difficult spot, right? Because we know that Iran has threatened to haul Pakistan into court and sue it and try to get it to pay a very hefty fine. I can't remember the exact amount, but a huge amount of money on the view that Pakistan has breached its contract with Iran by not building its part of the pipeline after so many years. But if it does try to comply with the contract and give in to Iranian pressure and build its part of the pipeline, there is the risk of sanctions from the United States. So it's a really big conundrum for Pakistan. We'll see how it decides to go about this. But I think that this crisis, this Iran-Israel crisis, by deepening levels of hostility between the U.S. and Iran, has certainly backed Pakistan into a corner in terms of how it goes about the situation with the Iran pipeline.
And what about Pakistan-Saudi relationship? As in, we have seen a lot of momentum in the relationship with a lot of visits. Even today, there's a picture of the Deputy Minister of Defense from Saudi Arabia meeting General Asim Munir. Do you think that there is some Iran angle to those engagements, or is it just purely coincidental that the timing is purely coincidental?
Yeah, I mean, there's always an Iran angle to any type of Pakistan-Saudi engagement, just because of the nature of the relationship, and the fact that Pakistan does try to play the role of a neutral in the Saudi-Iran rivalry. Though, the Saudi-Iran rivalry has eased just a bit since that rapprochement deal was concluded, and I think, on many levels, what's playing out in the Middle East. Saudi Arabia and Iran are, not unaligned, right? In the sense that Saudi Arabia has been very critical, not as critical as it could have been, but it has been critical of Israeli actions in Gaza. Saudi Arabia does not want to see an escalation of the Iran-Israel crisis. I think it's in line with both Iran and Pakistan on that front. But looking at how the Pakistan-Saudi relationship has evolved in recent months, it is quite clear that the Pakistanis want Saudi Arabia to be one of the big contributors to the SIFC, right? My understanding is that the original goal with SIFC was to attract FDI investment from the Arab Gulf states, the Saudis and others. And so I think that a lot of this recent diplomacy, at least from a Pakistani perspective, is driven by that goal. And we've seen a number of high-level Pakistani visits to Saudi Arabia. Of course, the army chief has been there, I believe, several times in recent months. And of course, civilian officials have been there as well. And it seems like the visit of the Saudi foreign minister recently was meant to move forward earlier talks about getting this $5 billion through, so to speak, to SIFC. And the army chief had been very much pushing that as well. So I do think that economic talks have been a big part of the engagements between the two. But that said, yes, I'm sure that Iran, and also more broadly the situation in Gaza, have been a big part of the discussions, and the readout, the public messaging has indeed emphasized that. It was notable. I don't think there was any mention, or very little mention, in the public messaging coming out of the Saudi foreign minister's visit about Iran and Israel. But the Saudis, they know. I mean, their relationship with Iran has gotten a bit better in recent months, but it's still a big rivalry, and they know what Pakistan went through earlier this year with that brief military crisis with Iran. They know what Iran did in Pakistan, and I'm sure that's something that they could try to exploit if they wanted to, if they're looking to get Pakistan to distance itself from Iran, not do as much. I don't think that the Saudis are in the business of trying to push Pakistan not to pursue that pipeline with Iran. I don't know, quite frankly, but I don't think that the Saudis would be pressuring Pakistan to back away from that. Honestly, I think that they and others, and certainly the US government, I should say, don't actually think that Pakistan is going to go through with that pipeline. I mean, that's just my sense. But anyway, bottom line is I do think that commercial relations have been a big part of these engagements with Saudi Arabia recently, but they can't help but cover the issues, the broader strategic security issues, the conflict playing out in the Middle East, and the Iran issue as well. I'm sure that those were discussed as well, and this was a strategic not to have the Iran-Israel crisis out there in the public messaging.
Well, thank you for that. Just a last question from my side, and then we are open for questions from the audience. Please, if you have questions, write it down on chat, and then I'll read it for Michael. Michael, what probability would you assign for a US-Iranian conflict over the next 5 years?
Well, I think a big question there is who wins the election? Our election, the US election. We've seen that even everything that's happened in the last few years, I do think that a President Trump would be even more hostile to Iran than a President Biden would be. So, President Trump is someone that likes to be seen as the guy that's tough on terror, tough on the bad guys, but he doesn't start wars. Um, and I know this is one reason why many in Pakistan appear to support him, particularly those from a particular party, because he didn't start any new wars and so on. But I just think that the chances of a conflict might be higher if you have a different government. If Trump returns, just because of his track record on Iran, very hostile to Iran. This is not a case of him wanting to be the maverick and have talks similar to what he did with North Korea, right? I don't think that he would have any interest in doing that with Iran. My sense is that he and those that would be close to him in a second Trump administration would view Iran as a bona fide threat. Um, so that's one factor. I think another factor is how the war in Gaza plays out, how long it continues, what else does Iran do in that regard? Um, what does it do to try to threaten U.S. interest? I mean, will it try to empower its proxies to intensify attacks on U.S. interests and assets and personnel in the Middle East, right? That's something else. We don't know how that plays out, but I think a lot of that would depend on the U.S. position vis-a-vis Israel and its war in Gaza. So it's very hard to ascribe the likelihood, what degree of likelihood of a U.S.-Iran conflict. I don't think that we're going to see one. I don't think that we're going to see a direct conflict between the two anytime in the immediate future. But we have to sort of the signposts that I mentioned are things to consider, and also the who's occupying the White House come January 2025.
So the follow-up question obviously would be what's the probability of President Trump returning to the presidency?
So I don't have a mandate to discuss U.S. domestic politics, so I'll defer on that. I think perhaps I'll just flag here the views of the trusted experts here in the U.S. on domestic politics that seem to suggest something like a 50-50 likelihood, which doesn't really explain much. But basically, it seems that it's just very difficult to know right now. Though I will point this out. I think that the U.S. position, or the Biden administration's position on the war in Gaza, has been a game changer. It's very unusual that a foreign policy issue can actually impact an election in the United States. But we're really looking at that playing out now. I mean, given just how much anger there is from so many among the Arab American, Muslim American communities about how the administration has approached the war, and not only that, but how things have played out in the United States, with perceptions that there have been efforts to silence those voices that have been vociferously supportive of the Palestinians and so on. These are just perceptions that I'm articulating here, but you have a number of states, Michigan for one, that are important electoral states. They have large Arab and Muslim American communities. And I think there is a view that this could be something that could hurt Biden in the election, and obviously that would only help the other candidates, so to speak. So I think that the situation has changed in a way that benefits Trump more so, given how things have played out since October. But again, I don't have a mandate to discuss that, so I will defer to U.S. domestic political experts to weigh in on those types of things. I'll let you talk to them.
Thank you, fair enough, and thank you for those insights. Moving to the first question from Emma Nadeem, he's asking, what's the impact of Israel-Iran conflict on the energy supply security of the South Asian region?
Yeah, that's a critical point. A lot of impacts, and particularly for India, for Pakistan, and Bangladesh. We know that these are countries that depend heavily on energy imports from the Gulf. Yeah, I think that the dependence in the case of India, you don't have the dependence on Iranian oil that you used to, because India essentially drew down its imports from Iran to avoid US sanctions risks. But as this, as instability continues to widen and intensify in the Middle East, that clearly makes energy security all the more precarious, and particularly looking at how things have played out in the Red Sea. I mean, this is clearly a huge story when it comes to security of energy supply for so many countries around the world, certainly those in South Asia that depend so heavily on Gulf, on hydrocarbons from the Gulf, from the Arab Gulf in particular, from Iran, and certainly from Iraq, and others as well. So I think that this is very much a concern, not just in terms of security of supply, but also, of course, pricing. And we'd already seen shocks to energy prices coming out of the war in Ukraine. So it's sort of like a double blow, so to speak. And none of these countries in South Asia that are dependent on hydrocarbons from the Middle East have enough indigenous supply, ready to use indigenous supply, that they could basically compensate and shift course, right? I mean, we know that India has a lot of coal. We know that Pakistan has, certain levels of indigenous resources of gas, though not nearly as much as it used to have, for sure. But the energy transitions are going very slowly. India has been leading on that effort. It has been able to scale up its clean energy generation, particularly in terms of solar, but not nearly enough to tide the country over to meet demand. And so it then remains heavily reliant on energy from the Middle East. And India has been showcasing the clout of its navy to essentially project power and really serve as a net security provider to protect Indian ships traversing the Red Sea and the Indian Ocean more broadly to the east, as well as projecting power to protect seaborne energy supplies and vessels of other countries as well. But I think it sort of is an outlier there as well. The other countries in South Asia don't have that type of naval power projection. So this all makes energy supply all the more precarious. And obviously, the more the geographic scope of the instability expands, the more concerns you have for the energy supply and energy security of these countries. And there's no clear solution, no immediate solution. Which, yeah, it certainly is a big concern. I think there's three main reasons why this instability in the Middle East is so concerning for South Asia, and particularly Pakistan. One is energy interests. The other is trade interests more broadly. We know that a number of countries in South Asia rely heavily on countries in the Gulf and the Middle East for a number of products. And also, the diaspora factor. As we all know, there's large numbers of South Asian communities across many areas of the Middle East, particularly in the Arab Gulf region. And if things were to get really bad, if you were in a worst case scenario, you have a wider war in the region, and you then have many South Asian expatriates basically leaving and going home, that then could obviously have impacts on remittance flows, which Pakistan certainly depends on heavily, as does India and Bangladesh and Nepal and a number of others. So there you could have notable impacts on the macroeconomy if you're not getting those remittance flows because people aren't working in the region making money to send home.
Yes, so the situation can get very messy. Where does that leave, or how does that impact Pakistan's engagement with IMF, the ongoing ones for the next program? Do you think IMF would be receptive of these risks and would try to help Pakistan given the risks of a broader conflict in the region? Or do you think that those risks would hurt Pakistan's chances of getting a new program? How do you think the IMF would take all of this in consideration?
Yeah, I don't think it would hurt. I don't think it would hurt Pakistan's chances of getting a new program. I think certainly the all of this economic volatility that we're discussing, I think amplifies the importance of Pakistan getting this deal with the IMF. And of course, it's getting close. There is a staff level agreement. Um, but I think that the IMF's strategy would be the same. It wants to work with Pakistan. It's made that very clear. So long as it gets the buy-in from Pakistan, that it'll undertake the types of reform that and austerity that the IMF always looks for and definitely is looking for at this point. So I don't necessarily think that. I guess that one could argue that the the problems in the Middle East and the economic implications, the troubling economic implications that has for Pakistan, could be a sort of one of the the justifications that the IMF provides to Pakistan to argue for the need for Pakistan to work with the IMF in the sense that this assistance is important. We want to work with you to get it, especially because if not, there's a lot of vulnerability given what's happening in the Middle East. But you need to be willing to work with us on X, Y, Z. So yeah, I don't think I think that it really sharpens the importance for both Pakistan and the IMF of working together to get this deal finalized. But again, it's pretty close, right? I mean, you got the staff level agreement.
The
In
previous
my
program, but I was
understanding,
referring to the next one. Pakistan has applied for an $8 million extended program,
oh, the
and
future one, right? Yeah. Well, same thing, honestly. I mean, I don't know. I mean, I'm not privy to what the IMF is thinking about a future program, but I think the view is that what's happening in the Middle East is not going to calm down at all. Well, the Iran-Israel thing may de-escalate, but the broader instability and volatility is not going to calm down anytime soon. So I think the same dynamic will be in play if you were to have potential negotiations for another deal, for the next deal. And I think the IMF would make the same argument that this assistance is important. Got to be willing to hunker down and commit to these reforms. My sense is that the current government in Pakistan, and certainly the military, there's not going to be any hemming and hawing like there was previously with the last deal, like there was with the previous government, the Khan government, which hemmed and hawed for a while. I don't think anyone in power wants to hem and haw. I think that the goal is to get a new deal. As always, there's these questions that have always been out there. How much, how long would Pakistan be willing to abide by the IMF conditions, all of that, but I think that there will be a very strong motivation for Pakistan to get this new deal and do what it needs to do to convince the IMF that it's an important one. A lot of discussion about this when the Pakistani finance minister was in Washington and he met with senior officials at the State Department. Everyone, the U.S. very supportive of a new deal and so on. So I think it's of when, not if.
well, thank you for your insights, Michael, and joining us early in the morning. Just a final question, and the question from the audience is they're asking whether Saad is asking that do you think that the conflict in Ukraine, Russia, and then now in the region will it increase Pakistan's or improve Pakistan's relationship with the US? Because what we saw was that it felt as if after US pulled out of Afghanistan, they stopped caring about Pakistan. It wasn't relevant, and hence people feel that that's why President Biden was not even interacting with the Pakistani prime minister. Do you think the regional conflict changes that? Does it improve Pakistan's importance in DC?
Yeah, that's a good question. There has been a lot of speculation and reports, and also some inputs from contacts that I trust that Pakistan has, even if indirectly, or Pakistan's military, even if indirectly, has provided small arms to Ukraine. Again, this is something that has routinely been rejected by the Pakistani government. So can't. But if that's true, that I think certainly has been a boost for the U.S. Pakistan relationship. Um, but I think that other factors, quite frankly, have been bigger drivers in reshaping the U.S.-Pakistan relationship post-Afghanistan withdrawal. I mean, climate change has been a big area that the current administration wants to focus on. And, it's interesting for all this talk about how the U.S. wants to reshape its relationship with Pakistan to focus more on trade and economics and investment, which is true. But my understanding is that given events of recent months, CT is actually is coming back to the fore, and I think that looking at what ISIS-K has done of late, its attack in Moscow some weeks ago, its attack in Iran, shows that it has been able to develop the capacity to project a threat well beyond Afghanistan, and that certainly is concerning to the U.S. And so I think that we are likely to see some more focus on CT in the U.S.-Pakistan relationship. Obviously, Pakistan has its own concerns about terrorism, mainly TTP, but also ISK, and of course it's based just next door in Afghanistan. So I think that'll be a factor as well. But yeah, I mean, the Ukraine issue, Pakistan has taken the position that many global South countries have taken, position of neutrality, officially. But again, if it's true that it's quietly providing arms to Ukraine, that certainly helps the U.S.-Pakistan relationship as well. But Pakistan is also importing oil from Russia now, as we know, and that's been confirmed. So that's sort of another factor there. Bottom line, I think that the U.S.-Pakistan relationship is in a pretty good place. It's not nearly as deep and expansive as it was a number of years ago. It's still trying to find a new identity post-Afghanistan. But I think that there are some notable areas that can be explored in cooperation. Again, though, the election will be critical. I mean, this is a conversation for another day, how the U.S.-Pakistan relationship might change if President Trump comes back. But it's in a pretty stable place. It's got some good things going for it now, and I think what's nice is that there's no crisis in U.S.-Pakistan relations. There's no drama, and that's nice, given that over time, as we know, in past history, it seems like there's always some type of tension or controversy or something. It's nice to know that things are smooth in that regard.
Now, fingers crossed, and that's a good note to end. And Michael, thank you for your time, and best of luck for your visit to Pakistan next week.
Thank you very much. I appreciate it. It was a wonderful conversation, and thank you for those that tuned in too.
It's always a pleasure. Thank you. Take care. Bye-bye.